Writers, for today's lesson, you are going to want to have your draft arguments in front of you. You've been doing a lot of work over the past few days. You dove into complex investigation, got some research done, composed and revised a preliminary position, and then drafted that argument. Done all in just a few days. You got some stuff done. Right now, before we go any further, I want you to look over your draft argument and identify which part you think is the strongest, and then which part still needs more support. Go ahead and do that work. Today, I want to remind you that to strengthen an argument, writers include only the strongest possible evidence, choosing evidence that is the most relevant, significant, and convincing. Even with the strongest evidence, they expect to explain its pertinence to their claim. So let's do some quick work with this together. You already know much of what I'm about to show you, so really today, what I want to do is remind you of the payoff that comes from ranking and rethinking evidence and revising your draft. Okay, so let's start. Here is part of my argument that child soldiers should not get amnesty for their acts. I wrote, one of the strongest reasons some child soldiers shouldn't get amnesty is that they can be a threat to national security. The reason that Omar Khadr didn't get amnesty, for instance, is that he was full of pride in his actions and full of hatred toward the United States. For example, former interrogators and Dr. Wellner testified that when Khadr was angry at his guards, he would recall how he had killed a U.S. soldier. The implication, of course, was that Khadr was, in the words of one interrogator, cold and callous. My point in this part of my argument is that some child soldiers are a threat to national security. So my job as a writer is to find the most convincing piece of evidence I can to make that point. I can't just say any old thing here. I don't get much room for evidence, and my listener isn't going to give me her full attention forever. I have to make my point quickly and efficiently. Sure, my statement that Omar was proud and full of hate supports my point, but do I follow it up with the most convincing, significant, and relevant bit of evidence I can find? Do you remember the article, The Child Soldier on Trial at Guantanamo? I want you to either take out your copy or at least have a copy open in another tab on the computer. I'm going to have you look at that article more in depth. So, what kind of evidence would I use to be even more convincing? I want you to think about that for a second. What evidence could I include to help people understand my specific point that soldiers like Omar can be a threat to national security? So there seems to be better evidence that I could have chosen. Do you agree? I'm going to go back and look at the article again and see if I can do better. In fact, let's do this together. Let's get several more quotations that support this point, and then we'll rank them and decide which is the strongest support, the most convincing. So take a minute, look back over one of the articles, and put a star next to any parts that you find that we might be able to use as strong evidence for this point. Take a minute to read over these quotes and compare them against what you had found in the articles. Now I want you to order this evidence. Remember, you're thinking about which is the most relevant, the most significant, and the most convincing. So sometimes you come across new information in your research that leads you to do more than redo parts. It leads you to rethink your position. So I should probably So take a second to reread my rewrite and see how it compares to your thinking. Would you have done it the same way? Would you lead with that quote or cut that part out? What are other transitions and framings that I could have used? So, when writers are building strong arguments, they weigh in and evaluate their evidence, considering if what they really need and what they need to include. And that's what you're doing. You have to weigh in on the evidence that you've already collected against what you're learning and what you think strong evidence would look like. Then, just as I planned what I'd write leading up to the quotation, as well as what I'd write after it, you frame the evidence in your writing to make sure that your reader is following your line of thinking. Writers, let's think about the choices that you might make today. You know that one way writers revise their writing is to look over the evidence and the presentation of that evidence to figure out if it's the best it can be or if they can do better. Can you find evidence that is more significant, relevant, or convincing? Can you put your evidence in an order that is stronger? Can you frame your evidence in a way that helps your reader understand your thinking even more clearly, leading up to the evidence and restating afterward the parts of it that you find to be important? You've got some practice with that work today on my writing, and now you can do this work in your own draft. You also know other ways to craft your arguments so that they are more powerful. You might work on your language. You might paint a tone throughout your piece. You might consider if your introduction is effective. You might frame your evidence more thoroughly. You might make your conclusion more powerful. And you also have checklists for different kinds of writing that can help you improve your writing. Okay, go for it. Off you go.